Welcome to Ask Alan Anything. We're excited for our program today. Big issues have been mask. Lots of questions about mask, but those aren't the only questions. We've had a special session, and what has the special session? What does that mean for businesses? We have a second special session on the way. What does that mean for business? There have been questions about social distancing bracelets, so we're going to talk about that, and probably going to talk about some other issues coming from Salem and from Washington, D.C. Pleased to have joining us today Brittany Quick Warner, who is the president and CEO of the Eugene Chamber of Commerce. She's joined us once before. Brittany, welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So social distancing bracelets, have you heard about those things?
So I think I know what you're talking about, but you might have to enlighten me. Are we talking about the ones where, like, if you go into an event, you can kind of pick the color that aligns with sort of what your comfort level is?
No, but I've heard of those as well. Well, we will get to that. But okay. First, we're going to talk about masks. As you know, the governor has issued an order requiring people going into certain businesses to wear masks and is expecting the businesses to enforce her order. What do you know about that?
Yeah, so, this is a topic that I think kind of lights a lot of people up. It's one that people feel very passionately about. I think that, there's definitely been pros and cons to the statewide mandate. One of the pros of it being statewide is that there were, businesses within specific counties who were already being required to do this. And, it kind of made for, it's similar to any conversation we have where one community has a rule, another community doesn't, and makes for enforcement. But then also, our businesses operate across county and city lines. And so to have, sort of disjointed policies across the state sometimes is a bit of a pain for some businesses. So the benefit of, a statewide mandate is that there's some sort of consistency. But I think that the obvious downside, and the one that I've heard the most, is that the way that the order was written and the way that the mandate has come down is that businesses are responsible for implementing this. And I think that puts a lot of burden and onerous on the business owner who is just trying to get by, getting their businesses back open and keeping their employees safe, to then be responsible for a customer who doesn't want to wear a mask. I think is a lot to ask of our businesses.
Well, I have the governor's order right here in front of me. And oh, by the way, we will email a link to this order to everyone who has registered for this webinar. For those of you viewing on demand afterwards, we will put a link to this and a link to other items that we mentioned in the comments below the window for the video on YouTube. It's interesting. The order starts by defining what businesses are. So it says, okay, business is supposed to do this, and that's created some confusion. But it says, for purposes of this guidance, the following definitions apply. Number one, business. And they list a number of businesses: grocery stores and retail and fitness and restaurants and bars and ride sharing services. These are all customer facing businesses.
Yeah.
So later in the order, when it says business is supposed to do this or business is supposed to do that, it only applies to those businesses specifically listed. And those all are customer facing businesses. And it says, then it goes on, a business is required to do certain things. And one is there to require employees and contractors and volunteers and customers to wear a mask, a shield, or a face covering. These businesses are required to provide masks, face shields, and face coverings for their employees.
Yeah.
And they're to provide accommodations for people who have disabilities and can't wear masks. And we're going to get into that here in a little bit. And they're supposed to post signs. Businesses should, but are not required to do 3 other things. Provide no-cost disposable face coverings to their customers and visitors. That's recommended. It's not required. Posting signs in other languages. That's recommended, but not required. And an employee education program is recommended, but not required. Then the public, you and I, when we walk into a store or a restaurant, we are required to wear a face covering. If not, we're violating the order. Now, so that's the governor's order. But there's another question, and what does the governor want? Brittany, were you involved in the meeting with the governor at the time the order was released?
I was. So the order was released, and then on the Tuesday afternoon before the governor, before the day it went live on July 1st, so June 30, there was probably 25 or so business organizations that the governor called together to kind of talk about why she was doing it, what she was expecting with it. Less getting feedback, more kind of telling us what was going to go on. But yeah, I was a part of that.
So what were your overall impressions of that meeting?
You know, I think that the first thing is that we're in the middle of a public health crisis still, right? We really kind of hoped this pandemic was going to come and go a little quicker, at least the first phase, than it has. Our state is, in fact, not just increasing cases, but increasing the positive rate, which I think is important because, the rate of positive tests is a metric that has remained consistent. So we've, yes, increased the number of tests, but when you look at the positive rate, that's a way to kind of compare it throughout the pandemic. But I don't think that, again, this is my personal opinion, I don't think that businesses should be, or it felt like there was a lot of pressure that businesses had to fix this problem, and that the spread was being caused by employers or, folks coming into businesses, when, at least in our community, and I actually think most of the state, it's been more social gatherings than business interactions. And so I was a little disappointed because it felt like the governor was targeting businesses far more than I think was warranted.
Well, I think you're being very polite and very.
Can you tell I'm trying to be politically correct here?
Yeah, I've heard some other reports, and I don't have to be political. I'm an advocate, so yeah. I'm not a policy person. No, I was told that the governor's staff, as you indicated, that the governor's staff acted as if business didn't care and was not doing enough to prevent the spread of the virus.
I think that that's definitely the way that meeting was taken by a lot of folks. And I was, sitting there alone thinking, am I the only one who thinks that this is a little unfair for business? Because the businesses that I know and the businesses that we've been interacting with have been going above and beyond to make sure that their staff and employees are safe, and that their customers are. Because what honest business owner who is doing, the best that they can to continue to strengthen their business is going to not take precautions that would keep them open, right? I think that's the key here, is that, we want this to work because we want businesses to stay open. We don't want to go back into a shutdown.
Yeah, it was reported, they said that you business are not doing enough to enforce. You have to enforce this, otherwise we're going to shut everything down again. And that's interesting they would make that threat, because just a couple weeks ago, I was part of a meeting with the governor's chief of staff, Nick Blosser, and he said, no, we're not going to, in the future, we're not going to shut down again. We have policies in place and testing and contact tracing that we don't have to do what we did before. And now they're making that threat again. shut businesses down again, and this giant economic hole, financial hole that the state's creating in their budget is just going to get wider and deeper. Also, once again, I'm the advocate, but asking businesses to enforce a policy, in essence, with police powers.
Oh, that part I think is absolutely ridiculous. The fact that they put in their best practices to call the police if someone is refusing, there are higher and better uses of our police resources than coming by a business to tell somebody to put a mask on. But
what did they tell you were the best practices?
So, it was interesting because I think that this has been moving so quick out there. It was clear on the call that, the Oregon Health and Safety Board put out a best practice sheet that did say that if someone's not paying attention or not following protocol, that someone can call the cops and essentially trespass them. And the governor said that that's absolutely not what she wants businesses doing. So I think even internally, there's, a lot of contradicting information coming out. Best practices, what they outlined was for a business, if they're able to have somebody stationed at the front of their business, which most places have adopted that anyways, just to like control, flow of people coming in and out, to if someone doesn't have a mask on, ask them to put a mask on. If they say they have a medical reason why they're not wearing one, you cannot ask what that medical reason is, which again, I think, from the business perspective, of course, we want to protect that person's privacy, but as soon as they walk into the business and another customer sees somebody without a mask, now the business is the one who's being called to be reported for letting people without masks in. But if they say they don't have a medical reason to wear a mask, they just don't want to, then the business essentially is expected to refuse them to come in. They encourage businesses to try and accommodate folks by either asking if they can go pick something up inside the business for them, if they can do a call-in, if it's a restaurant. But ultimately, if the person refuses to leave, the original recommendation was to call and trespass them on your property. So all of those components, I think, are incredibly cumbersome for the business and takes little personal accountability into effect when it comes to people's own responsibility for wearing the mask. So.
And interestingly enough, those things aren't required by the order.
Yeah.
And yet, there's been at least one store which was warned by the state. They had a sign, but the state said, nah, the sign's not big enough. They didn't have anyone at the door, and they weren't passing out masks. Well, having someone at the door is not required by the order. Passing out masks is recommended by the order, but it's not required.
Not required, yeah.
Cabela's in Springfield was cited because there were customers in the store who were less than 6 feet apart. So they were cited for failing to maintain social distancing. It leads to the question, what is a business owner to do?
Yeah.
Businesses across the country have had a lot of problems when they have tried to enforce mask orders. There have been, throughout the country, there are incidents of customers assaulting employees that are saying wear a mask or you can't come in if you don't wear a mask. And it's not right to put the businesses in this position. Interesting, but I've talked to a couple of national retailers with operations in Oregon, and they are very adamant that for the safety of their employees, they are not putting anyone at the front door, and they are not confronting or challenging anyone who comes into the store and are not wearing a mask. They want them to wear masks. They encourage them to wear masks. They have signs, but they do not want to put their employees at risk. Just a few days ago, here in the Eugene area at a liquor store, a customer did not have a mask. This was after June 30th. Customer didn't have a mask. And as his purchase was finished and he was leaving the store, one of the employees in there said, next time you come here, please wear a mask.
Mhm.
And the employee was assaulted by the customer. That's right here in Eugene. I mean, this is a very real threat for employees. And Oregon's OSHA rule is a little different than the national rule, in that nationally, employers are responsible for the safety of their employees. In Oregon, it's both safety and health. But here you have a conflict.
Yeah.
They're gonna say you're protecting employee health, but this is really public health, not employee health.
Mhm.
But you're putting the safety of your employees at risk to do so. As a lawyer advising business, it's very hard to tell them what to do, and the best I can do is just lay out the options and let them make a choice. And if they choose not to have someone at the front door and not to confront employees, customers, then they are in some very good company. And those are organizations with much deeper pockets probably than our local businesses. So you mentioned disability of a customer. I received a question from someone that said that they had heard that in order to qualify as a disability and not have a mask, they needed to bring a doctor's note. And I hadn't seen that. Have you heard about that?
No, I have not heard that they have to have a doctor's note.
Well, a report I received yesterday, at the end of the day yesterday, is that OSHA still has not issued a guidance on that. So for the person who asked that question, I don't know where you heard what you heard, but we're waiting to hear from OSHA.
Yeah.
We also received a question from a manufacturer that said, well, we're non-public, but we let people into our business, vendors and delivery people. Does that make us public when they are there? And then how do we go from public to non-public after they leave? And the answer is no, this doesn't apply to you. Although the rule says businesses must do these things, in the definitions, it is limited to just those customer-facing businesses that are set out in the definition sections, the things we talked about before. So liability issues. We have, I can tell you right now that there are plaintiffs' attorneys who have been conducting seminars for months now on how they can exploit this crisis. And in the mask area, there's a couple issues. One is, can a business be sued if they refuse entry to somebody? Well, governor hasn't given the business immunity from that. And I think at this point, it is a very real risk. Similarly, can they be sued if there are customers in their establishment without face coverings? Yeah, probably. I think there's going to be a causation problem here.
Yeah.
They might have to prove that the person who wasn't wearing a face covering had COVID-19 and that is how this person contacted it. But I don't know. Lately, the rulings I've seen through all this, there's been a lot of crazy rulings that don't really seem to recognize the established law up to this point. And I know that some people are going to disagree with me and some people are going to fuss at me. But through all this, we're seeing that the state, both this state and other states, that the governors are I don't know if they've been granted, but people are acquiescing and allowing them to exercise crazy power. So I'm losing some confidence in the rule of law, and I could see that it'd be impossible. So if I go into a store and I'm not wearing a face covering, and someone goes in the store and later they saw me there, and and they later have come test positive for COVID-19, can they sue the store without knowing my name, without knowing my infection status?
Right.
In some instances, courts start employing percentage analysis. So you factor in your damages, and you apply a percentage probabilities. Well, that might not be a big deal in one case, but of course the attorneys are going to try to do class action lawsuits. So businesses, if the governor wants them to enforce her orders, the businesses ought to have immunity from these sorts of lawsuits. Have you heard discussion of this, Brittany?
Yeah. So in the so see me, there you go. There were quite a few things that we're going through, but the issue that did not make it on that special session that the business community was pushing really hard for was this issue of liability. We know that there's a special committee convening right now, that they did not ultimately take that up this last session, that they plan to do so. At least that's what we've been told. In the next special session that's called, we're thinking sometime early August. But you're right. Right now, the legislature is kind of refusing to take up this liability issue, and I think it's a huge issue that businesses are going to be facing if the governor and the legislature decides not to do anything about it.
So now I want to transition, and a local business has at least suffered some PR damage by refusing to allow employees to wear Black Lives Matters on their face coverings. Oh, wait a minute, before we get to that. Face coverings or mask. I have been warning for weeks now that the language that businesses use are important, because a mask is different from a face covering.
Yes.
And if people are using the terms mask, but instead there are face coverings, there are attorneys who would not be afraid to pounce on that in lawsuits. And so I've been warning about that. But I mentioned the definitions in the governor's order, and for the first time, I see a distinction set out in the order between masks, which are medical grade masks, that is the definition, and face coverings. And so they're just starting to lay the foundation for a lawsuit based upon mask versus face coverings. So I know we all tend to use the terms mask. I correct myself. I am guilty, but face coverings, face coverings, face coverings. So Black Lives Matter's face coverings. One of our favorite local retail establishments. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a hard one. I think that this gets into, I think, a lot more complex issues of, freedom of speech within a company, and what a company has the right to sort of, restrict as far as freedom of speech goes with their customers or with their employees. I think that unfortunately this is going to be a PR issue for some employers, and I don't know. I'm not the attorney on this call, but to me it feels like if face coverings are going to be a part of our society for any significant amount of time, then we should probably be thinking about policies, employment policies, getting them into our handbooks about what's the dress code, and, making that really clear to folks. Like, if you want to dictate, what people are going to wear on their face, like, let's just put it in our handbooks and say, wear a black face covering or whatever, or wear a plain white one or whatnot. I think it's super unfortunate. I think employers right now we're stuck in this like crazy time between all of this racial unrest and the pandemic at the same time, and the places where they're crossing over are, it just feels like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place as an employer. So I have a lot of empathy for the folks who are trying to do the thing, still, business run, and have to think about a lot more than just what it means to put on a face covering that has some sort of special message on it.
Well, as the lawyer in this discussion, so for those businesses that have worked with me on employee handbooks, we have implemented dress code policies that refer to messaging on their attire for many years now.
Right.
I probably have some clients with old handbooks that don't have the up-to-date language, but it's been a number of years that we can have that. But we live in hyper-partisan times, and a MAGA T-shirt in the workplace could create some division. So could a T-shirt with the president in the image of a jester. The purpose of business is to do the business of the organization. It's not to promote these messages. And I would encourage employers to set in advance policies on dress codes. Don't limit it by any means to Black Lives Matter. Don't limit it to face masks, but it should be all attire. Although in the next version of our handbook, we probably are going to add face coverings as an item of apparel.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I think, something else along these lines, which goes beyond a face covering conversation, and just touches on the polarization, I guess. A lot of employers, I think, are going to, if they haven't already, I've heard of a handful in our community who have had to deal with this, thinking about their employees' conduct outside of work and how that impacts them as employers. And, with the level of activation in our community, there's definitely folks who are paying attention to what employees are doing out of work and then calling the employer to hold them accountable for that. And it's just making a lot of really, I think, unfortunate and tough situations for employers who maybe that employee wasn't, acting up at work, but they have a very present they have a high social media presence. They've maybe done some things that the employer doesn't agree with. So yeah, I just think that there's a lot of really complicated issues for employers right now when it comes to protests and being, active in the community or activists in the community. I've heard a couple stories in the last week that employers are just really struggling with how to deal with that.
Well, that's a great issue you bring up. That's also something that we've anticipated. In the handbooks we do for clients, there is a very robust social media policy, and it doesn't seek to control what the employees say on their own time, unless the employees do things to link themselves to the employer. And I can't recall the specific language I have right now, but we spent a long time developing it, very thoughtful, and so far the reports are it's been effective. Now, some people may say, oh, this violates some of the pronouncements by the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. Well, here's a couple things. I have done special presentations called the NLRB Gone Wild. They've made all sorts of pronouncements that are not the rule of law. They may claim it is, but here's the interesting thing. The NLRB, there is no private right of action. So even if what the NLRB has adopted were enforceable, and I don't think it is, but even if it were enforceable, the business can't be sued as a result of it. And in fact, they can't even be fined by the NLRB. They may be able to be subject to future injunctions saying you have to do certain things. But if that's the case, we'll deal with those problems when we can. Sadly, I've seen so many employee handbooks prepared by, even prepared by lawyers that follow all of the NLRB guidelines to the detriment of the employer when they're not required to do so. The situation you described creates a very real danger and damage to a business. And businesses have to be able to deal with this. And I will tell you right now, contrary to what other people may tell you, business can address this. But as you say, it's important to do so up front.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest message I have for folks is to be thinking proactively about this, because I do think it's 3 or 4 businesses last couple of weeks who have been faced with this. Someone has called them out for actions of one of their employees, and they've had to, retroactively figure out how to deal with that situation. So I think it's just we're just living in really polarizing times, and everyone's just hyper vigilant, or people need to be hyper vigilant, but people are just like highly emotional about some of the issues that we're dealing with. And so with the prevalence of social media and people are going to do things outside of the work hours that could come back and impact you as an employer. So I just think it's important to be thinking about proactively.
Well, and the problem that you describe is so prevalent that it even has a name, the cancel culture.
Yes, the cancel culture. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Horrendous, and employers shouldn't have to be dealing with this stuff, but they are. So
yeah,
it is important to be proactive and adopt policies that give you the ability to respond to these situations. So you mentioned the special session.
Yes.
And so we did have a special session. There were 3. So the special session was called to deal with COVID. And there were 3 COVID-related bills. One of them was the liability protections that you mentioned. And they decided to form a committee. The second one is a workers' compensation presumption standard, so that if you, Brittany, develop COVID, the presumption is you got it at work and it's covered under workers' comp, which of course will greatly impact the workers' comp rates for employers.
Yeah.
And that too got referred to a committee, but this is a standing committee. MLAC, I think it's called, Management, Labor, something. Anyway, there's a group of management and labor representatives who have been working to protect the workers' compensation system. And so this has been referred to that group. And then there was a bill to set a new infectious disease standard governing employers, and that bill was pulled. A lot of opposition from business groups, unanimous in their opposition, and it was pulled. That's the good news. It's amazing. 3 COVID bills, no movement on any of them. There were 6 police oversight bills that passed. And then on this COVID special session, just a couple days, a long list of other bills were passed. And how could they have done this in just a couple days? Well, this was the list of bills that did not get passed during the last session after the Republicans walked out over cap and trade issues.
Yeah.
Of those bills, maybe the one that's of most interest to business is House Bill 4202, which was a technical fix for the corporate activities tax. We would like to see a repeal. We would like to have at least seen a postponement as businesses are dealing with all that.
Yeah.
But at least there were some technical problems that were resolved. What am I missing? Other thoughts on the special session?
Yeah, so a couple of the bills that were approved around the COVID stuff. So there was the extension of the state moratorium on residential and commercial properties, right? House Bill 4213. So it was set to expire end of June. Let me find it. I'm reading here now. Instead, it'll be banned in most cases until September 30th. Renters will have until March 31st to pay back unpaid rent, but will be expected to pay current rents accrued beginning October 1. So there was a lot around evictions and moratoriums, both on the commercial and the residential piece of it. And there was some activity around as well. So there was quite a bit of activity around just rent and home ownership and building leasing. So,
well, and I just recently went through that bill. There were some protections for landlords in the governor's orders, which did not make it to this bill.
Into the bill. That's what I thought. Yeah.
So for those businesses that think that put procedures in place in response to the governor's orders, those procedures are no longer valid, and you can get in trouble. So if anyone listening to this is a landlord, pay special attention to this bill. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, 4213. That was the number.
So what do you hear about a special session?
So, we're kind of expecting that another special session does come back around. I don't think it's going to be before August, but I don't know. I think that, the big question and the huge issue that they punted in the first session was budget, right? How are they going to deal with the budget shortfalls that they're going to be getting or having? And so we know that that's a big one. And then, like we said, the liability piece just was not addressed in this first session. And so that's a huge component of at least the business lobby's work that is going into the second session.
So the governor can only issue across the board budget cuts. It takes the legislature to cut one program less and another program more.
Itemize it, yeah.
I mean, to my mind, this could be a big bloodletting session.
Yep. I think you're totally right. I think that there's, we saw some initial kind of ideas of where cuts would come when they were just a straight across the board cut, but there's no way it's going to end up being that way. I think there's going to be a lot of nuanced cuts that are going to come in, and it's going to get political.
So Oregon State Senator James Manning here from Lane County, Eugene, wanted to join us today, and I had questions I wanted to ask him about that. But then he was assigned a committee, and his committee is meeting right now. So he wasn't able to join us, and he asked for a rain check. But I hope to invite him to join me in 2 weeks to discuss special session round 2 questions.
Yeah.
Special session, the sequel.
I think Senator Przanski would be a great person to talk to as well, because he's been assigned to the committee on the liability issues. He's got some opinions about how he thinks that should go down. So he's a good one for us to locally be working with.
So there have been some things going on in the last week. Yesterday, and I have not read the opinion yet, but yesterday the Oregon Supreme Court decided what is known as the Bush case, which says that Oregon's limit on non-economic damages to plaintiffs in personal injury actions are unconstitutional. So what are non-economic damages, you might ask? Those are damages for pain and suffering, highly subjective. And this is an area where trial attorneys can ask juries questions. Well, how much money would it take for you to agree for me to cut off your leg, or whatever injury the person has incurred? And it can get very emotional, inflame the juries. It can cause for tremendous damages. But even if you're a business that does not suffer a personal injury case, it will affect insurance rates for everybody. So that is a concern. Have you been following the Metro Council's payroll tax issue?
I was just barely briefed on it, and we have a weekly call with and just heard a little bit about it on Wednesday. So I'm not as educated as I'm sure I will be, but I did hear that they're putting out another payroll tax measure. So,
well, and here's what's concerning. I guess the original plan, it was to be paid, was this transportation plan was to be paid in part by businesses and in part by non-business taxpayers. And it's disturbing. It's a disturbing trend that employer-paid payroll taxes seems to be the new go-to revenue source. We've seen it down here in Lane County.
Yeah.
Or at least City of Eugene. MLAC, I mentioned that. Management Labor Advisory Committee. That is the group that works on workers' compensation issues. So I mentioned the good news about the Oregon infectious disease regulation being pulled from the legislature. So business thought that was the end of that. No, OSHA is now working on rules to do what they couldn't get through the legislature. And really is, during the middle of a pandemic, the time to set a new standard when there's already administrative order after order after order with guidances on top of it. Now we're going to create a whole new program. This is just ridiculous. Those were the questions questions that I have. So I want to apologize. I intended to give you more of an introduction than
That's
I
okay.
did. There were a couple of technical issues leading right into this. Our internet was down until about 15 minutes before we went live. So we were stressing here a little bit. And so Brittany has been the president and CEO of the Eugene Chamber for 3 years now. She came in during a very, very difficult time. And since then, there has been major issue after major issue after major issue, followed by a pandemic, followed by social unrest. And I think a lot of us didn't know you very well, and we were kind of wondering what we were getting when you were named to the position. But I can say that the board of directors of the Eugene Chamber at the time certainly knew what they were doing. So,
thank you, Alan.
Thank you for everything that you're doing for business. And I apologize on behalf of business for the fact that I doubt if you've had an easy month since you've been there. So
that's absolutely true. I love this job and I wouldn't trade it for anything, but dang, it's way harder than I thought it was going to be.
Well, just remember, you're the one who raised your hand and said you wanted the job.
Yeah, exactly. I know. I've had to what would I be doing if I wasn't doing this, though? It's just in my blood. I just, just doing whatever we can. And I'm just honored to be able to work with the businesses that I work with. And you guys are the ones who are being put through the ringer. So happy to do whatever I can.
So what are you working on right now? What does the chamber have coming up that people ought to be paying attention to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, we actually just lost our director of business advocacy. She was recruited away to LTD. She's the new intergovernmental relations manager. Fantastic opportunity for her. I'm really excited. So we'll be rehiring for that position. That's actually the role I was in before I was the CEO. So it's near and dear to my heart. The advocacy and the government relations is something super important to me. But one of the other components of what the chamber does is economic development. And so we have been putting a ton of time and effort into our economic development work and the strategy there. And then the pandemic hit, and it made it even more important for us to really be thinking strategically about how are we improving the local economy? How are we going to respond to this crisis? How do we make sure we can get businesses through this recession? So we've got a ton of work in that area. We actually launched a 501c3 kind of subsidiary, if you will, of the chamber, which is allowing us to separate our advocacy from our do some grant funds that we weren't eligible for as a 501c6 as the chamber, and to also just try and build up public-private partnerships in that area. But ultimately, we want to help lead a private sector economic development strategy. I think that, we have a really strong private sector here, and in order to grow that, we're going to need their help to really try and identify what are the barriers to business growth in our region. So that's a huge focus for us. On the policy side, we're staying really engaged in the public safety conversation. Those issues did not go away with this pandemic, and in some cases they got worse, with a lot of people leaving their offices and not working in the downtown area or in office spaces across the city. We've seen a lot more vandalism and just increase in some nuisance and property crime. So those are numbers we're watching closely. And I had a meeting with the police chief last week just to talk about what does this national conversation about defunding the police mean in Eugene, and how do we make sure that we're an active part of that conversation. And to me, the most important thing is the data. We have to look at the data. And if we can look at our calls and see what the majority of our calls look like, then we can make informed decisions about how we budget to respond to those things. Because the last thing that we want is to see a scenario where we're getting less response than what we have now, because what we have now is not adequate for our community. So that's a big priority for our chamber, and we'll continue to stay active in that conversation.
Well, if Eugene defunds the police, then they'd better refund the payroll tax.
Don't you worry. That is absolutely on our radar. That's why I think it's important that we're a part of that conversation.
Well, those are important issues, particularly the economic development. I look forward to seeing what you come up with that. I'm looking through my list of topics, and I realized I think we glossed over social distancing.
I want to know what this is.
So this is a device probably for I guess any business could use it, but there are bracelets look like a Fitbit that employees wear, and if two of the bracelets get within 6 feet of each other, then they shock the employees. No, they don't shock them, but they alert the employees that they're failing to maintain social distancing. And I suspect there's also some record keeping with that, because there is a cloud function to it. You can find more information on social distancing bracelets at k2.life. Now, I'm not familiar with the .life extension, but I was at the site today. I spoke recently at a national webinar, and this was a topic that interested a lot of businesses, and I suspect some of our businesses may be interested in this as well. So if you want to know more about social distancing bracelets, k2.life.
All right.
Funny domain, but it actually works.
Okay.
Brittany, thank you for joining us. If your schedule permits, if Senator Manning or Senator Przansky is able to join us, we would love to have you participate in that as well.
Yeah, I'd love that. Anytime. This is great. Thank you, Alan.
For those viewing, thank you. We will send an email out with a couple of references and some information talked about today. If you have any questions, just email them to me. It helps if you put Ask Alan anything in the subject, because then those get segregated. But we've received great questions. Thank you. And we'll keep doing this as long as people keep submitting questions.
Wonderful.
So thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. And if you're going to a restaurant where you have an obligation to wear a face covering, not a mask, face covering, and the governor's order said you're supposed to wear that face covering until you engage in an activity where you can no longer wear the face covering. So I know in restaurants, a lot of people take their face coverings off as soon as they sit at the table. Bill London on the KPNW morning call asked me this very question Monday morning when I was on their air. And he goes, when can I take off my mask? And he said mask. So when can I take off my mask? And I told him my advice to him was to just start drinking right away. Then
that's one way to get around it.
Now, when you drink, I mean, it could be water. I drink a lot of water. In fact, I went through an entire glass during this webinar. Anyway, I used to work for an old Norwegian carpenter, and he used to tell me when we were leaving, he would say, if you can't be good, be careful. So in honor of Arnett Danielson, I think that's my advice to all of you. If you can't be good, be careful. And of course, if you have questions and if we can be of service, don't hesitate to call either Brittany or I.
Yes,
We are here to help you. Thank you, everyone.